Hello, my name is Karen Golden-Orante here with Living Histories. I'm speaking today with Bill Zartman. This is a part 2 of a part 1 story about Bill as a prisoner of war at World War II in Stalag 2B from his Italian. You were picked up as a prisoner of war after the Battle of Cisterna. You were then trained up to Germany, and you were imprisoned in Stalag 2B, which was truly one of the worst stalags in Germany for American prisoners. You were telling us the story about your work in the farms, picking potatoes, and then you were sent off to harvest wheat. You actually jammed the thrashing machine. You and your friends jammed the thrashing machine, causing it to break permanently, and that was not a good thing. So could you tell us what happened after that?
Well, actually, it was a wonderful thing because it put us out of work.
Oh.
Yes, well, what happened was that the Germans, of course, were very mad. The guards that were there on us, they actually threatened to shoot us, and then the farmer said, not on my farm, I'll not have any death here. So I'll report you if you shoot these men, and my family hears and sees that. So the Germans then realized they better take us back to Stalag 2B, to Hauptmann Springer, who was the commandant of the Stalag 2B. They did. We went on a train, the 8 of us plus 3 guards, back to Schlachau, where Stalag 2B was. From there, they put us out on another Arbeitskommando, a work party in the forest, cutting timber 7 days a week, sunrise to sunset. And the 8 of us worked out there. And we were cutting timber for things like railroad poles. They were losing a lot of railroad, telegraph poles, beg your pardon. And the railroad tracks that they were extending railroad into countries that you never had rail traffic, because the gauge of the railroad in Poland and Russia is different. It's narrower than the gauge is on a railroad in Germany. So we were making all the wooden requirements, the rails, not the steel rails, but the cross members that the rails ride on, which are wooden chunks. We were cutting the wood for all those things. Anyway, that went on for a period of about 10 months there in 1944. And we get near the end of 1944, we're starting to realize that the Germans are losing the war, the Russians are advancing more rapidly than they expected, and we started seriously thinking about escaping. So we could hear some of the artillery from there, on the Russian front, and one day we were out working in the forest, and it was early in the morning, probably 10:30, 11 o'clock, and we hear a motorcycle coming up through the woods, and it was a German sergeant on the motorcycle, and he talked to the guards and the old forester, Karl Weiss. And after the sergeant left, they told us to get all of the tools and get it ready. We're leaving immediately. We walked back to our barracks where we were held. They turned in all the axes and saws and everything to the guards. And then we started with all the possessions that we had, which wasn't very much. So if you had any food left from a Red Cross parcel, you certainly were going to take it with you. Anything to keep you warm, you were going to take with you. So I took my blanket, my Afghan blanket that you referred to in the first segment. I took that with me because I knew that I was going to need it. It was, after all, the first part of January 1945. It was very, very cold and windy, and it was snowing. And we had no food, and the Germans had none to give us, so it was a pretty bleak outlook. So we started marching from the forest on a road that went into the town where the railroad was, which was several kilometers away. And we thought they were going to take us to this town center and put us on a train and take us somewhere. And we walked right through the town, past the railroad station, and didn't stop at all. Well, that certainly sends a serious message to you. What are we in for? Where are we going to walk to? The Americans and the British are 400 and some kilometers to the west. We couldn't possibly walk there. We'd never be alive. In any event, that's what we were doing. We were on this by demand. I'm trying to think of the right word for it. But on a march that was by demand of the Germans. We weren't volunteering to do this. And it was against all the rules of Geneva. But anyway, we're going along, and we had 3 guards. And then as we went along, maybe every 5 kilometers or so, we'd run into another group from another work commando in the area, and they would join us. So that went on all day, and we probably ended up with as many as 80 American, British prisoners in a line on a forced march, and probably 30 guards guarding us. It had, by this time, by the end of the day, the snow was maybe 5 or 6 inches deep. There were guys who couldn't make, they were just ran out of energy, and they went down, they were sitting and laying in the side of the road. And the Germans came along, the guards came along and said, either get up and walk or we have to shoot you right here. And they did. They shot some of the guys because they says they couldn't go any further. The Germans said, well, we have no facility to take you. We have no wagons for you, so, and nobody else can stay here with you. So that was the first indication we saw of how serious the situation was on both sides. The futility of the Germans in being able to control the situation, and our particular plight and what our future was going to be. Come the end of the day, we approached a large farmhouse and a large barn on the left side of the highway. And the Germans put us in the barn, and the house was abandoned and the barn was abandoned. They put us in the barn and to spend the night, and we had nothing. They had no soup to give us, no bread, nothing to eat. So we decided this is the time we better make our move and escape, because it was going to become increasingly difficult. If they got us back to Stalag 2B walking, we probably would never come out of there. So I got together with 4 other guys that I knew very well. We knew each other very well, the 5 of us. And we were guys who trusted each other. We were all Rangers, and we were all ready to do whatever we had to do to survive. So the 5 of us figured out a way to get out of this barn, which was no easy matter, but we did get out of there, and I won't go through all the details of that. So we got out of the barn probably sometime between 12 o'clock midnight and 1 o'clock. We estimated it was about that time anyway. The 5 of us made us out of the barn, and we probably had as much as a half a minute or a minute before they started firing at us. The guards there were 2 guards walking around the perimeter of the barn, and they would meet in the center maybe every 3 or 4 minutes. And we went on from there. We ran across fields, just running. We knew that they couldn't follow us. We knew they had no dogs. So we just kept running until we got so exhausted we had to stop. And then we stood there and had a little war conference and decided that we needed to split up, the 5 of us. So 3 of the guys wanted to head west to the Americans. 2 of us wanted to head east to the Russians. Each of us pleaded our case. We won our case and headed east. The other guys won theirs and headed west. Again, my rationale was that the chances of walking 400 and some kilometers to the American lines was just about zero to survive that. Because some farmer with a shotgun would shoot you, or the Hitler Youth would get you and torture you, or the Wehrmacht would get you, and you'd be in a worse situation than you're in right now. So we went along on the road, and we came to a place where there was, while the 5 of us were still together, we came to a junction in the road because we're trying to figure out where we are and what direction we want to go. And there weren't many options, there weren't many roads. And there weren't many road signs when there were roads. So we came to a junction in the road where there was a road breaking off of this heading west. And there was a sign over in the corner with 2 arrows on it. And one of them said Deutsche Corona and the other one said Schneidermühl. These are 2 towns in Germany, and we weren't familiar with them at the time, but at least we know that that was west somewhere. There was these 2 towns by that name. We, at this junction in the road, on the left side of the road on the corner, there was a building that looked every bit like a tavern. There was no sign of anybody being around. There were no tracks in the snow. There were no automobile tracks. So we figured it was abandoned. So 2 of us went inside the barn to look at it, the tavern, to look at it. And there was enough light to make our way around, and the bar was there. Everything was gone. There was no liquor or anything. But I went behind the bar and started pulling drawers open, and I got some candles and matches and a pocket knife and a map. And it was like fate had come into our game, because if there was anything we needed right now was some guidance as to where we are and where we want to go. And this map was an Esso-American oil map of the area we were in, this immediate area, covering all the way into Warsaw. So it was a gift from God, and we were grateful to have it. So at least now we know where we are, and we were able to find these 2 towns that I mentioned to the west. So those 3 guys headed off, the 2 of us headed off, going the opposite direction. And the 2 of us stayed together for several days, and then we decided that it was time for us to split up, because you really didn't want to be more than one. By yourself, you had a chance. 2 or 3 together, the more people there were, the more suspicious a German would be that you were an escapee. So we split up, the 2 of us, simply saying good luck, take care. And I was by myself for several days, and I got to a very large farm. We would travel at night and then sleep all day in a barn, up in the hayloft of a barn. So I was in this barn, and I crawled. It was a milk barn. There was a ramp went through the center of the barn, and there was an opening above to pull the hay down. And I grabbed a hold of that and pulled myself up through this hole. And I was walking along, crawling along in the loft, when my hand came down on a man's shoulder. And I'm not sure who was more scared, the pulse of his shoulder or the pulse of my hand. But in any event, after what seemed like 20 minutes was probably only 10 seconds, a very Cockney English voice said, "Who is it?" And I said, "I'm an American." And the voice responded and said, "A bloody American?" And that was how I met my friend Jock. Jock was a Cockney Englishman who had been captured at Dunkirk and was a prisoner for 4.5 years. He and I decided, come hell or high water, we're going to stay together, and our main point is to survive. Because we're close enough now, we knew we were very close, a matter of a few kilometers from the German-Russian front. So we explored this house we were in and decided it was a pretty ideal place for us, because the house was made out of stone and brick, and that was a concern to anybody escaping, because if you hid out in a barn or a house, there was a good chance you were going to get burned alive, because the Russians burn everything. They just burn all the houses, all the barns to the ground. So Jock and I were in this basement, and we had gotten supplies of water, and we had our candles, and we had blankets to stay warm, and we slept down there. And the second night we were down, late in the afternoon, we heard the sound of artillery fire. And the first thing we saw was some German tanks, half-tracks, that were headed west. And after they left, there was just quiet. And we stayed there overnight, and the next day, we heard the sound of vehicles, and we got up and looked out the window. We had put covers over the window so that nobody could see any light coming out when we had our candles lit, because we needed candles. We needed some light in the basement to be able to look at our map and figure things out. So in the morning when we hear these vehicles, we look out and we saw school buses going by full of, they looked like they were filled with German officers. And behind that there were German half-tracks and some German trucks. Then there was nothing for quite a while. For probably 2 hours there was nothing. And then the next thing we saw was some trucks. And the trucks, I looked at the trucks, and they were, believe it or not, Chevrolets. OD, olive drab color, military color, American trucks. And I'm looking at this and I'm speechless. And I said to Jock, I can't believe what I'm looking at. Of course, he didn't know a Chevy truck because he was a British guy and had never seen an American truck. I said, Jock, these are Chevrolet trucks. These are American. I don't know what they're doing here, and I don't know who's driving them, but we got to be very careful now with what exposing ourselves. So anyway, the trucks went. The trucks went. The trucks went. The first thing that went by, I beg your pardon, was Sherman tanks. That went by first, and of course they're olive drab. And I said, these are Sherman tanks. They're American. After the tanks went by, then the trucks came and they went by, both headed west. It got late in the day and it started to get dark, so we weren't about to go out and declare ourselves in the dark. So we barred the door with a piece of wood we had brought down from outside, and we decided we were drinking water and having some crackers that were canned crackers that the Germans had left in. They left some food items that when they left in their kitchen. They left in an awful hurry and weren't able to get everything together, obviously. It got to be probably 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and Jock and I are sitting down on the floor, taking an occasional look out the window to see if anything's going on. We didn't see anything happening. And then after a while we got up and we looked out and we saw houses burning off in a distance, off to the east of us. So this is the area that the Russians had just come through. So obviously they were burning down the houses and the barns, which added a lot of tension to our life. The next thing we heard was, of all things, a bunch of horses galloping. And this really blew my mind. I couldn't figure out what in the world is this. And as they got closer, we could see that they were all short guys. And I thought, the only thing this could be is Cossack infantry. Because I was aware of the Cossacks because there were two groups of Cossacks in the country where they came from, part of Russia. There were the Cossacks who believed in fascism and were fighting on the German side, and there were also companies of Cossacks who were fighting on the American side. That was the question in our mind: which were we looking at? We're looking at friendly Cossacks or enemy Cossacks. So we didn't have to worry about it because they made our decision for us. These Cossacks, a bunch of maybe 8 or 10 of them, rode their horses, which were like ponies, but they're very rugged, right up to the front of the house that we're in. So we're in the basement and we hear these guys walking around upstairs, pulling doors open and shut, slamming, breaking glass. And after a while, we could hear the boots of these two guys coming down the wooden stairway to the basement. They came to the basement, and at that point, Jock got up and got off to the left of the door. I got off to the right of the door, and impulsively, without giving it any more thought, I knew what would happen. I said to myself, what would I do if I were there? I would simply take my Tommy gun and fire a dozen bursts through the door. And that's what they're going to do. So I kicked this piece of wood out of the way and left the door fly open. And here's these two Russian Cossacks, short guys, stocky, crummy looking as you could ever imagine. But they had machines similar to my Thompson submachine gun that I carried, but a Russian Tommy gun is about twice the size of an American one, as is everything in Russia is twice the size of anything anywhere else. They started off by saying, Germania, Germania, you're Germans. And I said, yeah, Germania, jeden Amerikanski tovarzysz, jeden Englishan tovarzysz. I'm an American comrade, this is an English comrade. They kept repeating, so this exchange went back and forth for a little bit. And then the one Russian motioned for us to put our hands on top of our head like this, and he came over and frisked us, the one guy. And the only thing he found on me was my wallet. Now, when the Germans captured me, they didn't take my wallet. They went through it, but they didn't take it. They took my watch, they took my ruby ring, beautiful ruby ring, that my sister gave me for school. And
what did he find in your wallet?
oh yes, thank you. In my wallet, he's looking at these cards in my wallet, and I saw the one was my driver's license, and I said, Amerikanski, Chevrolet, and like this, like I'm steering it. And of course, he knew that the Chevrolet from the trucks. And then he said, Prima Chevrolet, good, the Chevrolet is good. And then he looked at something else, and I responded similarly. And we got through all the cards. My Social Security card, I said, work card. That didn't mean anything to him. And then one of the things that he looked at was I had a girl for the year 1943 when I worked in Boston for Procter & Gamble. I was dating a girl by the name of Mary Callahan who lived at Kenmore Square in Boston. And we used to spend the weekends up at Hampton Beach or down at Nantasket Beach. And there was a picture of Mary that I had taken at Hampton Beach where she had a full black bathing suit on, and she looked every bit of an American model. And the one Russian looked at that, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he showed it to his partner, and he said, Prima Amerikanski. So that was a real breaker for us. So they took us upstairs in the house, and the one Russian hollered for all his friends, come see the American. The first American they had ever seen. And it's really quite a feeling when somebody like that sees you, and you realize that you're the first American he's ever seen in his life. And it's a shock to them. So anyway, the one guy who was in charge of the troop told one guy to go he said, fetch the vodka. So the guy comes with a bottle of vodka. We took some glasses out of the kitchen, and he pours some vodka in everybody, and we have a toast to Roosevelt and Stalin. And Jock was he told me later on, not then and there, but later on, Jock said to me, why didn't they include Churchill? And I didn't know, but we found out the Russians really didn't like the English too much. So they wouldn't even toast Churchill. But Roosevelt they loved, because everything they were eating, cans of pork sausages packed in Chicago. So you can imagine you'd appreciate the Americans when you're driving their tanks, driving their Chevy trucks, and eating their pork sausages. So immediately I became very popular among the Russians, and Jock just sort of tagged along. I then asked Ruski officer Rozumish Amerikansky. I'd like to see a Russian officer. Is there a Russian officer who speaks English, who speaks American? And the guy rattled off something, and I said, "Nie polny. And he said, go to sleep tonight. We wake up tomorrow morning, Ruski officer. So we stayed in the house and slept. Some of them stayed in the house also and slept, so we knew they weren't going to burn the house down with their troops in it. So we stayed there till the next morning. The next morning, they had set up a headquarters just about a half mile ahead of us on this road. It was also a large building, and we went there, and it was a large farm, and it looked like it was a live working farm. There was still a chicken coop with chickens in it, and it looked like the people was busy. It was happening in the middle of the day, and they just walked away and left everything as it would be in the middle of a normal day. The Russians said, "We're going to have dinner. We're going to have a chicken dinner." So they had set up a big empty oil drum on top of some heavy rocks and built a blazing fire under it, and they kept throwing buckets of water in it until they had it about half full of water. And then they gave Jock and I each, they asked us if we had any arms, and we said no, and they said, well, you need to have arms because where you're going to be gone from here, there's Germans who haven't surrendered, who are hiding out in the woods, and they will kill anybody that comes along the road if they think you have any food on you or any weapons they can use. So they gave us each a Walther pistol and ammunition for it, and then they said, okay, now we're going to get our dinner. So we went over to the chicken coop, and the first Russian grabs a hold of a chicken by the neck, shoots him through the head, and throws him in this pot of boiling water, feathers and all. So the next Russian does that, the next one, so about 10 Russians do this, and then they said, okay, get your chicken, you know. So Jock and I, we're going to go with anything. And we did the same thing and put our chickens in the pot. Hours later, after drinking multiple vodka, the chickens are, one of the Cossack guys took his sword and stuck it in a chicken and said, yeah, they're done. And they were warm. I'm not sure they were done. It's amazing we didn't get deathly sick from it. But each one of us, and then you learn from them how they eat. The guy takes his chicken by the head and pulls off all the feathers, almost all of them, over the part. All he's eating is the heart of it, and he's just eating the chicken like this. And believe it or not, Jock and I ate that chicken the same as him, and it was the best meal we had had in over a year. And it's amazing what you can do. That would turn most people's stomach to do that, and yet it was nourishment. And it's amazing what people will turn to get nourishment. Mm. Anyway, the Cossack who was in charge of the operation, and after we got talking, and he said, I would suggest you leave early tomorrow morning so you can get as much distance in walking. And he said, he showed me on the map that I had that we should head for the town of Lodz in Poland. And one of the problems we had was that when the Germans took over eastern Poland, they took many of the towns and changed the names from German, from Polish to German. So the town we were looking for, Lodz, L-O-D-Z, was on the map, but it was Lichtmannstadt. So
nothing close.
It took a while to figure that out, only because of the other places around it that we're able to reason it out. So he said, anyway, this is the road you want to be on to get to Lodz, and it's going to take you 2 days to get there walking. So Jock and I went, and we started out early in the morning, and by late afternoon or mid-afternoon, we started looking for where we're going to stay overnight. There's no farm, so we were in a little village. And there were probably a dozen homes, maybe more, in this village. So we go into the first house, and we find a woman, a mother, and a baby laying on the kitchen floor shot. And we went in half dozen of the houses and saw the same scene. An old man laying on the floor shot. And it takes a while to get accustomed to that. No matter how much you're seasoned, it isn't easy to adjust to that, to see that kind of brutality. In any event, I left out one important thing. The Russians, when the Cossacks, when we departed from them, the guy said, one of the things you want to do is you're going to see a lot of little villages on your way to Lodz. You want to go in and go through them and loot, take all the loot you can with you, but take things that you can use to barter, because you can't buy anything in Poland or Russia. There are no stores, there's no place to buy anything. If you want food, you have to have something to barter with the local farmers. And the local farmers come to the train station every morning and spend the whole morning there with whatever they have to sell. So Jock and I start looking in these houses that we're going through for what's of value that we could use to barter with. So the thing that we noticed, that all these houses had silverware, and the Germans had left in such a hurry that they didn't have any, they couldn't take the silverware. They were more concerned about taking food and blankets and things to sustain life. Silverware wasn't going to sustain life for them. So anyway, our rationale was that silverware is the most valuable thing we're seeing here. So we're taking the silverware and stuffing it in. I had a pillowcase, and Jock had one over our shoulder full of silverware. This was over the course of several days and several villages. When we got to Lodz, there was another truck convoy of Russians headed west with supplies for the ammunition and supplies, and vodka for the front troops. And they stopped to take a break, and they were talking to us, and they looked at the pillowcases and said, "What do you have in the pillowcases?" And we showed them silverware to trade with for food. And they said, no, they don't need that. That's not what they're looking for. They have food, but the farmers have food, but the other people don't have food. And the only thing that they want to trade for food is something that has value that they can use. What they need is, for example, the most valuable thing you can have is women's underwear. So at first I thought he was kidding us, but he started to describe how their clothes, all they have is the outer garment, because everything is worn out from years of wearing the same thing over and over. So Jock and I, the next morning, we dumped out our pillowcases full of silverware, and we started filling the pillowcases with women's underwear, nightgowns, anything we could find that was women's underwear, we put in the pillowcases. And one of the houses we were in that we were looting, I was upstairs in the second floor in a bedroom, and I pulled open a drawer and a dresser, and there was a camera and a roll of Agfa film dated 1937. So I took the film in the camera, stuck it in my pocket, and then in the next couple of days I put the film in the camera, took all the pictures and threw the camera away and stuck the roll of film in my pocket. Never thought more of it. To jump ahead a little bit and unfinish this story on this camera, when we got to Odessa, where we sailed out of, we'll talk about that later, Jock and I were staying in the train station, and we had a very sudden opportunity came up for us to get on, hitchhike a ride on a British freighter or tanker to Constantinople in Turkey. And we left there, and I forgot that among the things that I left in the train station was the roll of film. A year and a half later, I'm in Cleveland working for NCR Company, and my mother writes me a letter and says, "There's a package came for you from France." And here was the pictures from that camera.
Wow. By
a Frenchman who I met in Odessa. And among the things that I left that I abandoned there because I left in a hurry, one of the things had a card on from my mother and had on the name of the family, my mother, Effie Zartman, and the address in Shamokin, Pennsylvania. So this guy wrote a letter to that address and included the pictures. But there was only 3 pictures on the role that ever developed. The role was the film was too old, I guess. Those pictures, two of those pictures that came out very clear, are in the book.
Yes, one on the cover, yes.
So yes, the one on the cover, and that picture, I'm the one on the far right, and Jock is the one in the middle with the baby carriage. Well, between the two baby carriages.
That's because you had to abandon even the pillow. Well, you took advantage of the carriages because the pillowcases became cumbersome.
Oh yes, yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, the pillowcases became very cumbersome. You're right. So we ran across a perambulator in one of the houses. We appropriated that, and then we found another one so Jock and I could both carry more underwear. And let me tell you what we would do with that. Every morning when we got up, wherever we were, we'd go to the train station. Most of the time we were already in the train station because we made that our base. And they were all bombed, but you could find a space, 5 foot square somewhere, that was still, you could still huddle up in a corner somewhere and sleep overnight.
Well, your goal was to get to Odessa because all the northern cities in Russia or the Ukraine were frozen ports. So Odessa was your goal. But that, as everyone can see in the map, is a long distance from where you were that you needed to walk to get to Odessa.
Yes. Well, we walked something like, we walked or went by boxcar. Those were the two methods of transportation. The first week or so we walked until we got to Lodz, that was where the first trains were running. But the trains were all boxcars because they were going to Odessa, because the northern ports, as you say, were all closed all winter long. So the Russians had told us that you can't get out of a northern port. So if you want to, you have two choices: wait till spring till the northern ports open, or go to the Ukraine, to Odessa, where a lot of American ships come into port there. But it was a long way. We were in no hurry. We were free. We didn't care whether we got there tomorrow or 2 weeks from now. We're safe, we're free, and we're among people who admire us. These people are making us feel like $1 million. We haven't done anything for them, and they loved us. It's an Amerikansky. Everybody, come see the Amerikansky. Anyway, what we would do in the train station every morning, the Polish, or in this case Russian or Ukraine women, wherever we were, would come to the train station with whatever they had that they grew in their farm. They might have some bread, they'd have some sausage, they'd have some eggs, and they would barter with anybody who needed to have something to eat. So Jock and I would go to one of these ladies that we saw had bread, and I would say to her, "Skoko zloty de biały chleba?" How many zlotys, Polish money, is it? Even though you didn't have money, you use that as a term to arrive at a value. So if you said 500 zlotys, then you had a value this loaf of bread at 250 zlotys or 1,000 zlotys. So it's a little deal in bartering. Bartering's an interesting thing, really, and it's still in use around the world, where people trade to get what they need. Anyway, we would do that. In some cases, maybe this lady had bread, but I also wanted some eggs from this lady over here. And usually I would trade every morning to get enough food for Jock and I to have a good meal. So I might want half a loaf of bread and maybe 4 or 6 eggs and then some sausage. And what I would do is barter with the lady who had the bread sometimes and say, okay, she had to make a side deal to get the sausage and the eggs, and then I could deal with just her in my transaction. Then they would work it out among themselves to get back whatever she owed them. I mean, it was a funny system, but they understood it, I didn't. So we were on the job training there, Jock and I, learning our way with it. And of course, communication was something. I picked up languages pretty quickly, but it's tough when somebody's really rattling off to you and you don't understand them. Anyway, that's the way we survived. And when we got to Lodz, the trains were running, and there was no station master, there was nobody, there was no information. So we would wait when a train would come in. Usually any train that came in would be there for at least a couple of hours because they had to take on wood and water because they were all running on steam because there was no oil, there was no gasoline or oil. So while they were there, we would talk to the crew of the train and say, "Where are you going?" Well, they might say, "Well, they were going to Austria, or they were going to Italy, or they were going." They didn't, because we would have taken them. But the closest train we could get for Odessa was the one we always selected. Every time we had to make that decision with it, being in a town where there was a train, we'd say, "Which direction are you going?" If they said north or west, east, we wouldn't take it. We wanted a train that was going south. So the boxcars were clean boxcars, unlike the filthy things that we were taken in when we were captured in Italy. And we proceeded with that until we arrived in Odessa. And most of the dates of these things are in the book there. I don't have them memorized, but I tried to follow the thing along day by day to understand when things happened and so on. Anyway, we got to Odessa and we went to the waterfront immediately and started talking. There were American victory ships in the harbor, which were the ships carrying the Lend-Lease goods, tanks and food and ammunition and trucks and so on. There were British merchant vessels, and there were several other countries, France represented with vessels. We talked to the Americans first and said, "Where are you, when you leave here, where are you going?" And they may have said Africa, or they may have said England, they may have said France, they may have said Portugal. But each time when I asked them, "Can we come aboard? I'm an American. I was a prisoner of war in Germany. I'm trying to get back to American lines, wherever that is. So I want to go east toward England, toward Italy or England." But they had been given orders. Apparently early on in this process, they were taking Americans, and they found out that there was also some Germans getting through. The Germans would take the dog tags from a dead American and take his clothes and everything and put it on. And if they spoke enough English, which a lot of them spoke pretty fluent English, Germans, they ended up in South America and lived for 60 years in South America. Some of them are still living there today, and they're 90 years old. And a lot of people don't realize that how many Germans were able to do that by establishing an American ID. Anyway, that was the reason they wouldn't take us on the American vessels. So we decided to go into town and see if we could find a bar and talk about our problem. So Jock and I went into the town and we asked somebody, "Where's there a bar?" And the guy directed us to a tavern. We had nothing to buy them with. We didn't know whether it was ladies' underwear was going to work with the bartender. But we went into the bar, and there were a couple guys sitting at the bar, and one of them was a Russian. And you could recognize the Russians by their clothes very quickly. So we started talking, and I had an idea immediately. So I introduced myself to this guy, told him my name, told him I was an American prisoner of war, and that I escaped, and I would like to let my family in the United States know that I'm still alive. Could you send a cablegram to my family if I give you the address and so on? He said, no. He said, this guy identified himself as a Russian news reporter for Izvestia and the Russian news cable company. Anyway, he said, no, I can't do that. So we're having a drink of vodka with him and one or two other guys that were there that were merchant marine. And this guy leaned over to me and he said, he said, I might have an idea. He said, maybe if I wrote up a human interest story about you, because the Russian people like to hear those things, he said, maybe somebody will pick this up because I can put your address on that this American who said these nice things about the Russian people lives in Shamokin, Pennsylvania at this address, and his mother's name is so-and-so. So anyway, he did that. Little did I know that a couple months later when I got home, one of the first things my sister said to me when my dad, my mother, and my sister came to Fort Dix, New Jersey to pick me up when I saw them for the first time. And we got in the car and we're going along, and my mother said, how we knew you were alive. she showed me a copy of this cable from this Russian guy, and she told me what happened. My dad had a gas station, grocery store, pool room that was a 7-Eleven all in one, and he had the only phone in our family. We had none in the house, but my dad had one in the gas station. So the phone rang one day, and it was the editor of the Allentown, Pennsylvania News Chronicle. And he said, is your name Zartman? My dad said, yes. He said, do you have a son named Giorgio Zartman, who was a prisoner of war? My dad said, no, I have two sons. One is Monroe and one is William. And the guy said, well, was one of them a prisoner of war? My dad says, yes, William. He said, well, there's something wrong here. His name is Giorgio. They didn't realize that Giorgio is the word for William in Russian. So they finally worked that out, however, and this editor sent this thing to my dad, and they knew for the first time that I was no longer MIA. Ah. Amazing how the world works. You have a need, and some goodness drops it on your hands. The map was dropped on us like a gift, and here, this editor, there's thousands of towns. He's the one that picked it up, and he's 80 miles from Shamokin, from my home.
So when you were in Odessa, you were able to get finally on a vessel to get out of Ukraine.
Yes, Jock arranged for us to get on a British tanker that was going to Constantinople in the Bosporus, through the Black Sea into the Bosporus. And we went on that. That was only an overnight. It was a day and a half about on the ship. We arrived in Constantinople, and then we spent 2 days there because I was hoping to get into the American embassy and get some help from the embassy. But they claimed that there was nobody who could talk to me. They took one look at me as filthy dirty, and they didn't want anything to do with me. When I got home, I found out that the governor of my own state of Pennsylvania was the ambassador there. I wish I had known that when I was there. Anyway, we got a ride on a commercial, a merchant marine ship from Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. So they changed that name of Constantinople sometime right around the end of World War II, I think.
And then you were able to get out of there, but that's where you had to part ways with Jock. Is that
no?
We were able to get
that
on
ship took us to Naples.
Oh, okay.
That ship took us to Naples, and of course in Naples I knew my way around because I had been there before I was captured.
That's where you landed.
Pardon?
It's like you did one big circle almost.
Right, exactly.
Right back to
exactly.
So,
and as a matter of fact, I think I have the distances in there that I traveled all together by land, by foot, by boxcar, and by sea. I think the one is 1,063 by land and 4,087 by sea. And my last line in my book is, "What a trip."
So you were then able to get from Naples to Boston.
Yes, I got into Naples, reported into the American command post there, and they put me in the hospital immediately, confirmed that my ID, my story blew their minds. They didn't want to believe it. They thought I was under some kind of sedation or something with this crazy story. But they finally proved got satisfactory results on everything, and put me on a special diet, a lot of steak and milk, because I was skinning. You can see the picture of me in there when I got home.
Yes.
I still was very skinny. I was never a heavy person anyway. I was very conscious of my weight control, but I was really skinny when I got back. And of course my mother was among those who was constantly trying to fatten me up.
So, and I'm trying to find how many, so you left when you were 18 and a half, 19 years old?
Left what?
When you left Pennsylvania, you were
16.
16.
The first year with Procter & Gamble, I started to work for them in the middle of the summer.
Right, but when you went to Florida, how old were you when you enlisted?
I had just turned 18. I couldn't enlist until I was 18.
And you were 20 when you were just about your 20th birthday when you escaped.
1945, January the 3rd was my birthday, and that's the day that we broke out of the forced march.
So
That's my 20th birthday.
that's amazing. And to think that is quite an experience.
I spent a year and a half working half a year working in Pennsylvania and New Jersey for Procter & Gamble. And then the year 1943, I spent the entire year in Boston working for Procter & Gamble, field advertising.
Right.
But I was the youngest guy. All their salesmen were being drafted. And they were guys who were 25 years old, but they were all being drafted. So P&G, if there was a warm body that could handle the job, because they just looked at me and said, "Can you handle this job?" And I said, "Absolutely."
So you returned when you were 20.
Yep.
20 and a half, almost 20 and a half.
I got back, the ship docked in Boston. I have the date in there. I think it was April 1945.
Wow. Bill, this was an amazing book to read. I couldn't put it down, and a lot of people that have borrowed this book from me couldn't put it down. And listening to your story has been such a pleasure. And one of the things I'm sure that you've heard your entire life is people thanking you for your service, and which has been a pleasure, an honor for me to listen firsthand. Thank you.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if anybody missed part 1 of our story, please keep your eyes open for it on 143 TV. I urge you to listen to that to hear about how Bill started his life. Thank you very much. This is Living Histories for the Cohasset Historical Society.